Quasar has two ways of handling validation. First, there's internal validation, which is built into Quasar, super simple, easy to use. And then there's external validation, which is great for when you're working with a backend or a third-party validation library, so something like vValidate. We're going to start off with external validation, and I'll start by opening up our form, create friend dialog. Now, let's imagine that we just hit a backend and we've got some errors from that backend. So const errors is equal to a ref, and we'll make that an empty object by default. This is what will hold all of our errors in it. And then we're just going to mimic getting errors from a backend. Function give me errors, and then we can say errors.value is equal to, and let's just imagine that there's something wrong with the name. So we'll say name, and then name must be at least 3 characters long. So the user's just clicked on this button, they've typed in a name, but they've only put in 2 characters, clicked on create, and the backend's come back and said, oops, your name must be at least 3 characters long. So to mimic that, let's just put a button here, q-button, label equal to give me errors. And then when you click on this button, we can call this function here. There we go. And just so we can get a little bit of an idea of what it looks like, how about we create a pre-tag in here with our errors, save it. And when we click on that, you can see that we've now got a mimic of errors from a backend. Cool. Getting rid of this pre-tag, let's see how we can now use those errors. And of course, you might have to tweak this example to suit the backend that you're used to using. Now, if we come down to the input here, it needs to know, first of all, if there is an error. And if there's an error, it needs to know what the message is for that error. So first of all, we can say error, and this is the Boolean that says whether or not the error exists. So let's just hard code that to true for now and set the error-message equal to something wrong. And you can see we now get an error state, but if that were equal to false, then it simply wouldn't show anything at all. So we need both of these values in order to work with external validation. So to know whether or not we have an error, we can say errors.name, and we need to use optional chaining here because it's possible that this value doesn't exist. If name is undefined, the rest of this would not work. So we use optional chaining and then say dot length. Now we're going to coerce that to a Boolean. We can easily convert anything to a Boolean by adding 2 exclamation marks at the front. So now we know if we have an error. Next, let's add a colon here and then display the error. To do that, we'll say errors.name. Again, we need that question mark dot here. And just in case we have multiple errors, since name is an array, let me just scroll up a little bit here and show that. Name is an array of all the errors we got from the backend. We're going to join them together with a comma. So coming back down here, join, and let's make it comma space. That means if we had more than one error, it would be the first error, comma space, and then the next error. Okay, let's save that. And I might refresh the page just to show all of this from scratch. Create, we have no errors. Now imagining we hit the back end and then got some errors back, we can see that that now works. And this is going to be the exact same concept using something like vValidate. Now, the usage of a library like vValidate goes beyond the scope of this video, yet don't be afraid to use what you've learned here with vValidate's documentation. These are the only 2 things you need to get started. Now, I recommend using their composition API approach, which I'll link to in the notes for this video. Okay, moving on to internal validation. So I'm going to remove these 2, get rid of this button, and then get rid of errors and the give me errors function. And we can also get rid of this ref here. Save it, and we're back to where we started. Internal validation is built into Quasar, and it's super easy to use. All we have to do here is say colon rules, and this accepts an array. The reason this is an array is because we might have more than one potential error here. and each item in that array is a function. If the function returns true, then it's considered to be valid. If the function returns a string, then that string is used for the error. So again, if it's true, then it's valid. If it's a string, then that string is used to display the error. So let's see how we can write this out. First of all, we accept the value as the first parameter. And how about we validate whether or not the name is more than 2 characters long? So now we can say here, val.length, so the length of that string must be greater than 2 characters. So if that returns true, then we get no error. Then we can use the OR operator to say, if that is false, return this string. And that string is going to be name must be at least 3 characters long. And that's it. This is how we use Quasar's internal validation. How cool is that? So simple, great way to get started, especially if you're prototyping and you're not doing fully fledged validation yet. You can just really quickly write in a bunch of rules like this and it's going to work. So let's test this out. If I type in L, it's invalid, UK, and now that it's over 2 characters in length, it works. Let's do a couple of others. Next, we have the email. So I'm going to pull in a library that just makes it easy to validate emails. Yarn add validator. And this is really cool because it gives you a bunch of functions that are really simple. There's no other logic. All it does is validate the field and give you true or false in return. So this is a great library to get you started with validation. Closing that out, let's come in here and add the rule. Rules is equal to an array. We take the value and we check if that value is an email. So in order to do that, if I scroll to the top here, we can now import is email, and you can see I'm getting autocomplete here. And all we need to do is wrap it in that function. Coming down to email, is email, and then we pass through the value. If that's true, then it's valid. If it's false, we can use the OR operator to then return a string. Please enter a valid email. Let's give this a try. We start typing, it's invalid. And then the moment that it is correct, that error disappears. How cool is that? So simple. This is a great way to get started with validation. I'm going to leave the next one for you so you can try and do validating the user's age. Maybe you can try checking if the user is over 18. But I will show you how we're going to validate an array of strings. Now, honestly, this example isn't particularly useful because these are the only strings you can select from this options menu anyway. But I wanted to show you how to validate an array because it's just a useful thing to know. So we can say here, rules is equal to an array. We take in the value, and then I'm actually going to copy paste these options here. And on that array, we can say dot includes. So this array needs to include the value. I like to read this backwards. If that value is included in this array, then it's true. If that's not true, then we say, please select a valid OS. So let's go ahead and save that. Again, it's actually impossible to select an invalid OS, but there are situations where you might want to validate an array, and this is how you can do it. Lastly, there's one thing that kind of bugs me about this validation, and that is that it's a little bit aggressive. So the moment I start typing, it starts yelling at me and saying that my name must be 3 characters long. Well, I haven't even finished typing it in yet. And I don't know why, but it kind of irks me when websites do this and they have this aggressive validation that validates the moment you start typing. And of course, we can easily prevent this, and we do that using lazy rules. So I'll show you how that works. We can come up here, and above rules, I'll just say lazy-rules. Copy that line, Control-C, and then we'll just paste that above rules for these other inputs. Now, if we refresh the page and try this again, it's not validating until I click out of that input. or if I tab out. So if I do LUKE tab, then it validates. So this is closer to what I would actually use in my apps. To finish up, let's see how we can check if the entire form is valid. So there's actually a few ways to do this depending on your needs. I'm going to show you the most JavaScripty way, which will give you the most flexibility. Then if needed, you can take a look at the Quasar docs to learn more about submitting forms with Quasar. For example, you can do native form submits. That is, of course, possible, but we're going to do everything in JavaScript for this video. Let's create a function here, which is for submitting the form. What I'm thinking is, rather than emitting create straight away, first we're going to validate the form and then emit create if it's valid. So I'll come up here and say submit form, and we'll make this an async function. The reason it's asynchronous is Quasar actually supports asynchronous rules. So for example, something like a username might have to hit the backend to check if that username is available. In that case, you can actually use promises inside of your list of rules. That's why we actually need to use async await here. All right, let's say const is valid. We're going to check if it's valid. And now we need to tap into the form component and call validate. In order to do that, we can create a reference to this component. So we talked about this in the documentation video, and we'll call this form component. Now we can come in here and say const form component is equal to a ref. Therefore, this ref will be equal to the form component. Now we say, hey, form component, can you please validate for me? Now, as I said, since we can use promises, we actually need to await this in order to get the value. Now we can check if it's valid. So if is valid, then we're going to emit create. So now, rather than calling create the moment the form is submitted, we're actually going to call submit form. It validates the form, and then if it's valid, we'll go ahead and create. And this is great because it's going to give your user a much better experience than just using a backend. Sometimes you might want to do some light validation on the front end to basically say, before we submit this form, I'm just going to check that a few things are correct for you. So often you'll even use a combination of both, a little bit of front-end validation and then heavy back-end validation that really makes sure everything is done correctly. Oh, my lint is being helpful and saying that I need to import that ref. And now if we click on create, and I'm not going to fill anything in, click on create. As it turns out, I was a little bit naive in validating this form, and you'll notice that I've got an error here. So let's open up the console. And then the moment we press create, we get this error. This error isn't particularly useful for what's going on. Now, the problem is some of my validations are returning an error, which further up the chain is giving me this cannot read properties of undefined reading focus. So it's unrelated. I just wanted to point that out just in case you run into something similar, which you likely will writing validation rules. And this is how we need to fix it. So closing that out, throwing this back on the left side of the page. The first problem is we're calling val.length. But by default, value is going to equal undefined. So we're trying to call length on undefined. So we can put in optional chaining here. And the other problem is email always expects a string? A quick way we can fix that is using null coalesce and making that an empty string. So let's try it again. And now when I try to validate, scrolling back up, we get an error. Type something in, and then clicking on create, now we get an error on the next value. So that's good to know. And now you can validate using JavaScript on your form. Now, let's finish up by putting one in just to check that we can put in correct data and create something. Lily, which is my bigger chihuahua, Lily at example.com. She's really tall. You should see her. Most people don't even think she's a chihuahua. And I think she's 8 or 9 years old. She's not a human. And she tells me that she likes using Linux. So we'll select Linux there. And we'll pick a color for Lily. She's got like this nice sandy color. So let's choose something like that. Yeah, that's close enough. then create, and it works. Now I've got all of my friends, 2 of which are my dogs. I need to stop coding and get out more. So there you have it. I'm hoping you now feel in control building forms with Quasar. See you in the next video.